Hello? Oh, great. So thanks for having me here today. CRPS is a cause I'm passionate about and have been for years. And of course, as a nutritionist, they have me go right after lunch, as they typically do, which I'm sure you're all frightened of or scared of, and I just want to put your fears at ease right now. I am not the food police, and I'm not here to bash you about foods today. Quite the opposite. The fact that I'm a nutritionist that went to chef school should say something all on its own. Very few nutritionists that I've met have the relationship to food that I have, and that is that I love food. I love to eat. I find food delicious, and ultimately, I find food to be the pathway to health. So I am coming from that standpoint, and no matter what it is that you've decided to eat or not eat today, I'm just here to share some information. So let's start with that. And we're going to do a few things today. I want to talk to you first about this idea of inflammation, and I know you've heard about it today, and you've probably heard about it from some of your other doctors along the way, and I want to examine it from a nutritional standpoint, which may be a little bit different. And then I want to talk about some of the basics, the foundations of nutrition, and then I want to get to kind of the good stuff, and that's some of the foods, and leave you on that thought. But first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about what is the connection between CRPS and food. I get this question all the time. Is there a connection? Why is there a connection? Sometimes it doesn't make sense for there to be a connection, but there clearly is, and research shows that now. First, there's foods that provide us the nutrients that we need to thrive. I mean, to do our everyday function, right? And we need those nutrients to survive. So, okay, that says something about food. There's foods that are known to provide some sort of a pain relief. We'll talk about a few of them today. But as a CRPS patient, this is great news, because this means that there are things from nature, in nature, that you can be consuming to reduce your pain level. Fantastic news, right? There are foods with the potential to stimulate nerve regrowth, healing, regeneration. I mean, this is where the research is at right now, right? That food can be this powerful that it can help to heal and regenerate. What a fundamental, just great thought and backing of what I do for a living. So on that note, let's get to some of the science of what it is that your body does. I want to, like I said, start off with some basics on inflammation. And I've given you a very technical definition here. It's a localized physical condition in which part of the body becomes reddened, swollen, hot, painful, especially as a reaction to injury or infection. So most definitions are going to be something technical like this, and they will be something that observes, right? Like this definition is just observing injury. It means if I hit my finger, it's going to throb, it's going to be red, and I can just see that, right? So that's what this definition is talking about. But very few definitions dig a little deeper. What's happening inside of your body? And this is some of the fun stuff that we can get into as a clinician and say, hey, what's really going on? So let me share some of that with you today. First and foremost, inflammation itself is not a disease, okay? So I want to clarify that right up front. Inflammation is a natural response to cellular damage or a perceived threat. So it's something that we should be doing. In fact, it's something really good because it's actually your body's attempt to shield itself from something negative, okay? And when it's shielding itself, what it's going to do is it's going to create fighting cells, chemical mediators, and it's going to bring about extra nutrients to make this healing happen. So if we think about the core of inflammation, think of it as a fantastic reaction that your body's able to move this quickly and heal. So we need it to survive. So what's the bad part of inflammation? What's going on? Well, it starts to get a little bit tricky here. All inflammation, good or bad, is marked by two things. And one, I love this concept. One is that part of your body is destroying itself, right? You're taking cells that have something that's gone wrong in them, and then your body is destroying those cells. And at the very same time, your body's trying to rebuild good cells. It's interesting, your body will often do this where it destroys something that's good because it's infected by something, right? So you're taking something that was good and then you're going to destroy it and try to get rid of it. So you're flushing out good with bad. But you're doing that because your body thinks it can repair and regenerate that too. So there's both cycles happening at the same time with inflammation. Let's think about that from a nutritioner perspective, because it means that your body's taking all kinds of nutrients to make this reaction happen. And like I said, the majority of the time, this is great news. It means that when we're trying to fight the flu, it means that when we get a cut, we're able to fight it off very successfully. But I want to relate it back to CRPS, because things really go wrong and they really react differently in the body of a patient with CRPS, as you guys know. And the first thing is that inflammation becomes chronic. And that means that it's persisted. It hasn't gone away. It's lasted much longer than it should have. So whereas inflammation is typically a reaction that's short, to the point. It gets rid of, whatever that infection is, and then great, moving on, inflammation's gone. That's not the case in CRPS, right? It's persistent, it sticks around for a long time. You start reacting to things that you normally wouldn't, and they cause more and more inflammation. And what's wrong with this is that a lot of things, but first, the inflammation is perpetuated by the nervous system. Great, try to change that, right? And then also, what happens is that over time, the inflammation becomes multi-system. So something that started off very regionally, all of a sudden spreads to other organs throughout your whole body, and especially in CRPS, it can end up affecting just about any organ in your whole body. And this, of course, leads to deterioration, breakdowns, right? Loss of function. Really not great news for CRPS. And in part, this happens because of this simultaneous destruction and reconstruction. If we think about that process, how long can your body possibly keep that up, right? How long can I possibly just be constantly destroying something while trying to rebuild it? I'm only going to have so many nutrients before something goes horribly wrong, right? And that's a deficiency. But I'm here to tell you the good news. I'm here to talk about what can be done about this cycle of inflammation. And I do want to make clear, I am a nutritionist and I believe in food. I also don't believe that there's one cure-all for CRPS. What I'm here to do is give you a little bit of a competitive advantage. There are so many things oftentimes stacked against you. There are so many things that you do not have control over, but nutrition is one of those few things that you do have control over. Right? It's one of the few things that can push something over the edge to give you a fantastic result. So why wouldn't I take the path? Why wouldn't I seize the opportunity to make a change where I can and stack the odds in my favor? And so when I see a CRPS patient, I'm thinking about two things up front. The first is I want to provide better nutritional support for the body, because it takes a lot of nutritional support to regenerate and to build and to grow, right? And that takes some basics, and we'll go through some of those today. And then the second issue is we need better nutrient absorption. Because as a whole, with a lot of inflammation in place, nutrient absorption tends to be really low for CRPS patients. I think few of us have just a really good understanding of how difficult it is to truly digest, to get nutrition out of your food, to have that nutrition then convert into something that my body can use, and then, to make it work for me. If I think about an apple, I'm not going to get 100% of the nutrients that are in this apple, because I have to eat this apple, I have to digest this apple, and then the nutrients that are in this apple have to become what we call bioavailable. And that's a process that can take quite a lengthy amount of time. So how much nutrition I get out of my apple or any other food that I consume kind of has to do with how good my body is at taking something and converting it into something that I can use, if that makes sense. When there's a lot of inflammation present, unfortunately, I'm just not that good at breaking things down and pulling out the nutrients and using them. I oftentimes say that, for example, a child, one of my toddler children, for example, they can pull out 95% of nutrients out of food, no problem. But a patient with CRPS can be pulling out as low as 10-20% of nutrients out of food. So hopefully this gives you an understanding why sometimes even though you eat, you're still starving afterwards, right? And there's a lot of reasons why, but at a fundamental level, there is some nutrient deficiency going on. So we're going to talk about some nutritional basics because the first is I got to be able to cover the basics before I cover any of the advanced stuff, right? So I've put up here, and it's really hard to read in this font, but the 6 essential nutrients I've put up here are water, carbohydrates, proteins, minerals, vitamins, and fats. And we're going to go through each of those today very quickly. And the first one, and perhaps my favorite one, is water. And the reason it's one of my favorites is because so many times patients say it's so hard and so costly to eat organic, to eat healthfully. And I say, well, did you get enough water today, right? Because that doesn't cost a lot, and you all have access to it, and it's the first step to health. And water on its own is responsible for so many different functions. We'll talk about them. But first I want to point out, you know, half of our bodies are water, or they should be. Half to 3/4, right? So 50 to 75% of our body should be water, and typically are water. But something is really different with CRPS patients. One of the first things I do when I see a patient is I take a nice long metabolic panel so that I have a lot of numbers in front of me, and I always take hydration levels. And low hydration levels are a great indication that there is a lot of inflammation present. And as a whole, my CRPS patients tend to run in that 38 to 42% of hydration. Think about how low that is when I said you have to be at least 50% hydrated, and then I really like to push my patients to be more like 65% hydration throughout the body. When I get patients, you know, CRPS patients tend to be in that 38, 39, 40% consistently. Does this mean that you're not drinking enough water? Well, sometimes, right? You may have lost the thirst. You may have just, you know, doesn't taste that great. You're not feeling great, so you're not thinking about drinking water. That's a possibility. But I know others of you are drinking plenty of water. Quite the opposite. Probably some of you are just drinking more water than most people do. And you're just having to go to the bathroom all the time, and it's inconvenient, but you're still doing it because you know it's good for your health. And yet, your numbers still come in within that range. There's still, you know, maybe you've done a little bit better. So you're at 40, 42% hydration, right? Okay, well, what's going on? We'll talk a little bit later about how mineral deficiency leads to some imbalances. But being hydrated at its core is key to so many different functions. So I want to stress that it's not all just about organic foods or refined foods, but it's about basic functions. And the first one of those is water. And I talk a little bit here about how if you drink enough water, I mean, it maintains the balance of fluids in your body. We talked a little bit about that. You need a certain percent, right? And water can help control calories. A lot of my CRPS patients are facing a situation where they're just consuming so many calories, they never feel satiated and they never feel energetic enough. But drinking enough water can certainly make us feel a little bit fuller. It can certainly make us feel a little bit more satiated. So it's a great first step. Water helps to energize the muscles, and this one's important. A lot of my CRPS patients suffer from repeat spasms. If any of you have woken up with a muscle spasm at night or get them during the day, my first thought will always be, are you hydrated enough, right? There are minerals at play here, but it definitely all has to do with the hydration of that muscle that's needed in order for it to be in a relaxed state. Water helps keep the skin looking good, and it's not just about looking good. Our skin is the biggest organ in our whole body, so it's about really health from the inside out. And then, of course, water helps with our kidneys and some of the bigger organs, which are important because many of you are probably on different medications or have gone through different protocols, or even if you're not on any of those, I just said, most of your organs at this point probably have some sort of an inflammation issue. All right, so let's move on to the next. Oh, and last but not least, bowel function. This is one that I get all the time from CRPS patients, right? My bowel function's not right and it hasn't been right for a long time. What can I do? The first step is always drink more water. There's a lot to be done there. There's a lot to work with there, but certainly make sure that there's enough water on board. Okay, I think I've beaten this one to death, so let's move on to the next one. And that is carbohydrates. Some great examples of carbohydrates for those of you who are still unsure what they may be. you know, we think of cookies and bread and pasta as our typical carbohydrates, right? Wheat products like, you know, bread, crackers. But I also wanted to remind you that carbohydrates includes vegetables and fruits. And we typically think of carbohydrates as being responsible for our energy. And it's true, they're in part responsible for our energy. And this may be why when you're feeling a lack of energy, which you may be if you're having some sort of a flare-up, you're probably going to turn to carbohydrates. It's one of the foods that we think we digest quickly in order to get energy from quickly. Today I want to dispel the myth that this is the only place that we can get energy from, but it's certainly our largest source of caloric intake for getting energies. We've got proteins, and of course, most of us know, chicken and beef, those are proteins. There's a lot of examples that aren't necessarily animal-based. We have avocados and peas and legumes, different kinds of beans. Those contain a lot of protein, of course. And kind of something interesting happens. Foods are not always in neat categories of one or the other, right? We can have that intersection, for example, nuts. There's going to be fats and carbohydrates involved, or beans. There's going to be some of both involved. So that can happen, of course, in the protein category as well. Proteins are your friend because they're responsible for regenerating, healing, and maintaining your cells and your nerves. So if we think about foods that are friendly for CRPS patients, I'd like to go to healthy proteins for that. And I think, hey, some patients come and say, I have a hard time breaking down some proteins. So sometimes it's a process of finding which proteins are going to work for you. But bottom line, know that this is a CRPS-friendly food group. Then we have fats, another CRPS-friendly food group. And fats can be, I put olives up here, olive oil, nuts, seeds, avocados, different kinds of oils. The list goes on. Fatty fish, for example. And fats are responsible for, they hold fat-soluble vitamins, so it's responsible for moving those kinds of vitamins around. It's also responsible for a lot of the healing and repair in your body. So you can see how eating a good amount of fat would be very helpful in your position. I love fats for a number of reasons. We have a lot of research at UCI. We do a ton of research on patients that have inflammation in their bodies. And studies have shown that patients that eat more healthy fats tend to eat a little bit less carbohydrates, which is great because carbohydrates are actually kind of really hard to break down. And also, fats help to regulate your blood sugar levels, which makes it so that you feel full longer, you have more energy for a longer period of time, and it means that overall you're probably going to consume actually less calories throughout the day. Aside from all that, there are some fats that are fantastic at helping to lower inflammation and even more importantly at helping to lower pain. So omega-3s is a great example of that. It's a natural NSAID, so much like a lot of the medications you may have been given in the past. So it helps block some of those pain pathways up to your brain. So what a fantastic gift that nature's given us in some of these foods. And we'll talk about some of those a little bit later too. Of course, there's vitamins. There's 13 vitamins that we need on a daily basis to be healthy. And I want us to focus on this, not to memorize anything per se, but I want to focus on this because, like I said earlier, it's so hard to get nutrients out of our food. And when we have CRPS, it's especially hard to get nutrients out of our food. So it's important to understand what is it that we need in the first place. So there's a ton of vitamins. There are 13 of them. They're divided into two families. We call some water-soluble, and we call the others fat-soluble. So the water-soluble vitamins, I'm sure you've heard of. They're typically the B vitamins, though there's some other vitamins that are in there too, like vitamin C and folate, biotin. And together, they're the water-soluble family. And I always find it interesting when patients with CRPS come to me and say, hey, I'm taking vitamin B5 fill in the blank, right? B2, B12, right? I'm sure some of you take some of these. And my question is always, well, why are you just taking one, right? Vitamins as a whole are responsible for every chemical reaction in your body, so you need them. And the beautiful thing, especially about the water-soluble ones, is that they help with a lot of reactions such as circulation and nerve function. So we need them all on board. And they work together even better when they're all there at the same time, because they can bind together and do fantastic things. So I always think of superfoods for CRPS as being the ones that just have tons of water-soluble vitamins in them. And where do I get those? I get those from vegetables, fruits, and certainly from proteins and fats, but mainly fruits and vegetables, right? And then there's a few others that I can only get from proteins. So I want to think about that. There's been all these studies on how are people that are happy different, right? Like, what is their chemical composition? People that have a lot of energy, what is their chemical composition? And we have found that both of these groups of people tend to have much higher B vitamin, water-soluble vitamins in their body than the rest of us. So it's a great tip. If I need to be happier, if I need to have a little bit of extra energy, go to those vitamins. And it's not just about taking them, it's about eating the fresh foods that have them. I will say this as a general tip. We normally think, okay, great, I'm going to eat this apple and I'm going to get nutrients. You know, that apple could have been sitting in your supermarket for a month or two or longer, or in the back room for multiple months, or being carried over from some other country, and so it was picked off a tree 8 months ago. So I want us to think that, hey, in this apple, the nutrients, the B vitamins, the water-soluble vitamins can really vary, even if it's the same exact food, right? Depending on the time of the year. So this is where that idea of kind of seasonality comes in. If we eat foods that are more locally picked, if we eat foods that are more in season, they tend to be much higher in water-soluble vitamins. And like I said, these are the vitamins that give us energy. These are the vitamins that people relate to happiness with, right? And these are the vitamins that so many of my CRPS patients are so deficient in. And in part, it's because the B vitamins are really finicky, right? They get flushed out, it's hard to absorb them. So there's every reason in your body why, it's responding to things that you're putting in your body beyond these B vitamins. Okay, let's talk a little bit about minerals. You can find them in proteins, you can find them in fruits and vegetables. There's other foods that have them too. Some carbohydrates will have minerals. And as I said earlier, when there's, for example, spasms involved, I oftentimes look towards minerals. When there's inflammation involved, I oftentimes, look towards minerals. And the reason for that is because one of the first things to go is this basic building block. You need minerals for every single bodily function. Like, think about that. Every function of my body needs minerals. So when I look at this family, they're so essential. When I think about electrolytes and just being hydrated, right, I look to magnesium, I look to potassium, I look to those minerals. Are there enough in my body? If you have CRPS, the answer is most likely you do not, right? And minerals are very interesting because not only do we need them, we take them in, but they become part of our body. We're actually built of actually a lot of minerals. That's a weird way of thinking about it. But if you have CRPS, you've probably been relying on those stores for a while, so chances of you having stores left are, you may have some, but how many? So it's a great place to start in terms of thinking about getting enough minerals into my body. Okay, let's talk a little bit about nutrient deficiency, because these basic building blocks are in place, meaning you need them daily, you need to replenish them. When they're not there, the result is nutrient deficiency. And this is bad news because, as I put here, nutrient deficiency leads to all kinds of imbalances, like imbalance in enzyme function. That's oftentimes important. Well, it's for everything, but think about your GI tract and not having enough enzymes there to break down your food, right? Nerve signaling. Really, nutrient deficiency can lead to nerve signal issues? Yeah, so key for CRPS. Digestive issues and metabolism, issues. And they get in the way of optimal growth, optimal regeneration. So this leads us to the real topic of today, and that is inflammatory versus anti-inflammatory foods. So this is my passion, and this is what I live by. I believe that there are foods that help with inflammation, as in help bring inflammation down. And then there's foods that actually make inflammation worse. So they bring your inflammatory levels up. And it's a weird way to look at the world, because that's not normally how we typically look at food, right? We look at it as these subgroups, like we just went through, you know, proteins and carbohydrates and all this. Or we may look at it from a different perspective. Is it processed or refined? Or if you've ever done a diet, you're looking at it from the restriction that, you know, some person put on you, and can I eat this or can I not eat this? Some of you may look at food, is it good for me? Is it not good for me? I don't know. But I offer a whole new lens. Let's look at this from a purely inflammatory standpoint, because after all, that's one of the main issues within your body right now. So you've got a choice. Obviously, that burger with the fry over there, inflammatory. On the other hand, anti-inflammatory. And I'm going to put up some examples. It's not the Bible. There's a lot more examples of inflammatory versus anti-inflammatory foods. And on the whole, what I want to say is take a look at those anti-inflammatory foods. They tend to be very processed foods, right? Processed sugars, common cooking oils, trans fats, dairy, corn-fed meats. There's others on there that should be on there that we'll talk about later too. But those tend to be things that have been processed. They're not in their natural state. They're difficult for your body to understand when it's trying to digest something. And then take a look at those anti-inflammatory foods. They tend to be much less processed foods as a whole, right? Vegetables, olive oils, you know, flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts, grass-fed and wild meats. They tend to be foods that are in, you know, in the state of nature, or in a slightly modified form, but still very close to its natural state. So if there's any kind of guide that I give my patients, it's, hey, is it natural or is it not natural? And this isn't about getting, you know, super obsessive. It's about just understanding the concept as a whole. And the reason for that is the more natural it is, the more your body can understand it. It's easier for you to digest. And if it's easier for you to digest, it's easier for you to pull the nutrients out and use those. So I want to take a tiny detour and talk about the difference between reactive versus allergic. So a lot of my patients come to me and they say, hey, I went to my allergist and I tested, you know, I have no allergies, or I'm only allergic to dust. You know, what does that have to do with inflammation? So allergic is a very specific reaction. You create antibodies, and because of that, you create certain chemicals like histamines, right? Reactive is completely different. You may have noticed that from the time that you were diagnosed with CRPS, or before you were diagnosed with CRPS to now, you're reactive to a lot more foods. You may have noticed that you used to be able to eat dairy and ice cream no problem, and now you may be reacting to it a little bit differently, right? I don't know if any of you have experienced that, but a lot of my patients realize that there's a shift in the body. Reactivity is also not always apparent. Sometimes reactivity is at the nervous level, so we can't tell. For example, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but CRPS patients tend to be very reactive to wheat, to gluten, because at the nervous level, it stops regeneration of nerves. So reactive is a very different definition from allergic, and don't think that your allergist will necessarily catch reactivity. And reactivity is, there's an ebb and flow to reactivity depending on the inflammatory level of your body. Okay, so now let's talk about key inflammatory foods for CRPS, and I start off with sugar. Sugar is just one of those addictive substances that we all love. On the other hand, sugar also blocks absorption of nutrients, and it flushes out other nutrients. So here, it's this endless struggle of trying to digest, get some nutrients out, feed your body, and then when you're finally able to do that, you put some sugar in your mouth, and guess what? You just flushed out all those nutrients that your body worked so hard to get. So I always tell my patients, you know what? Sugar, I know it's delicious. We know it's addictive because there's plenty of studies on that. But also, it completely goes against all the effort that you're trying to put into your body. And people oftentimes ask me about fruit. How does that relate to sugar? Is that a sugar? Am I allowed to have fruit? I mean, fruit is natural, so I should be able to have as much of it as I want, right? The problem is, hey, there's still sugar in that fruit, And I'm a big proponent in fruit, but I do ask my patients to limit their fruit consumption, especially try to not have fruit after 5 p.m. because it can get in the way of your sleep cycle. Let's talk a little bit about gluten. I mentioned it earlier. There's been some studies that show that for CRPS patients, gluten can have drastic effects. It can limit nerve regeneration. It's only in the last 3 to 4 years that some of these studies have really started showing some of these results. And that's scary because I can't go to a doctor and really test that. So some of these studies are really sophisticated. And does that mean I have to cut out every piece of bread ever, right? What I tell my patients is it's okay on a rotation to have it now and then. You don't have to become gluten-free overnight. But it is something that become aware of, research, read, right? You won't necessarily be able to feel the effects. Some of you probably do get effects from gluten and you feel quite not right. You feel probably like some of your energy has been sucked out a day or two after you eat it. But some of you will feel no reaction because it's at the nerve level, right? So keep that in mind. In terms of smoking, not only is it carcinogenic, but we've also know now that it can flush out some of your nutrients, block absorption of others, and that's true of alcohol as well. So just keep that in mind. If you're having that, glass of wine because you're celebrating, and the next morning you're just feeling like there's lack of energy there, it's probably because you flushed out a good number of your water-soluble vitamins. So I always tell my patients, I'm not saying don't have wine. I'm saying the next morning, remember to restock your body, right? That's a great time to have one of those nutritious shakes or, a really nutritious breakfast because you will need those nutrients. You've just flushed them out the night before. And it's okay, your body understands, and luckily you can just restock them. Omega-6 fatty acids, they've been in the news a lot lately. Omegas, and people talk about, the benefits of omegas, or are omegas bad, right? There's just all these misconceptions on omegas. The truth of the matter is that it's overconsumption of omega-6s that is bad. We eat 20 times more omega-6s than omega-3s. So in that ratio, they are bad and actually very inflammatory to our body. Dairy is another one of those where research only in the last year or two has shown very inflammatory for CRPS patients. And simple carbohydrates are just like sugar. So I want to leave you with a little bit. What do you see? And for those of you that love vegetables, and by the way, I'm not telling you to be a vegan, but I just want to show you a picture of foods that are whole, that are real, right? Because I see health. I see a possibility here. There have been so many things in your way since you were diagnosed with CRPS. There have been so many things that I've told you, you can't ever get over this, things will never get better. In fact, they're going to deteriorate further. And I want to show you there's actually a path. There's something that you can do to stack the odds in your favor. There is something you can do, and it comes directly from nature. So in conclusion, this is a lifestyle. Every time you put something in your mouth, you have a choice. Are you going to eat something inflammatory, or are you going to eat something anti-inflammatory? And this isn't about being perfect 100% of the time, because you get to make this choice so many times per day, right? 3 to 7 times per day, you get to travel down this path and make the right choice. And if you're making the right choice 80 to 90% of the times, your body will respond. And that's the beauty, is that your body does want to heal. It wants to support you. So you get to look at food through a new lens now. Thank you.